Welcome everybody. Great to see everybody here and your interest in this topic. Both Dodie and I have got some experience working in the nonprofit space, both as, we give our formal introductions in just a moment, but also just want to acknowledge there's lots of people with some great experience on the call as well. And so definitely encourage you guys to chime in if there's things you think will be useful for others to hear. We've got a couple of spots in the presentation where you can jump in with some questions as we go through, and we've also got a couple of polls just to get a quick read of the knowledge base that we have in the room. Okay, so these are the topics we wanted to cover today. Give a sort of a quick overview of the nonprofit scene, just make sure we're all talking about the same terminology and understanding of who the different players are that you would be interfacing with. I'm going to give a quick overview of Pledge 1%, which is where I currently work, because you hear about a 1% giving model through Salesforce a lot, and I think it's worth just getting some knowledge of that. And we'll dive into the specifics of what NPSP is, some of the configurations, things you need to think about beyond NPSP. Preparing and importing data is a big part if you're setting up this NPSP for a nonprofit. And then our presentation includes a whole bunch of resources and things at the very end, because this is a pared down version of a much longer presentation that Dodie and I did before. So without further ado, Dodie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dodie Friedenberg, and I have been in the Salesforce space since 2017. I went through the JVS training program. I went to work for a national nonprofit that happens to be located here in San Rafael. I'm up in the county, and so I started doing part-time consulting work with them. And then I went back to JVS as the instructor for 2 cohorts. And then I've continued to support the new instructor. So I know some of the folks who've just come out of the program and continuing to help and support them a little bit. And my ancient history includes 3 years of nonprofit service down the peninsula. I know where Brisbane is. I used to live in San Mateo and San Carlos. And a long time ago, there was a suicide prevention, rape crisis, and family stress service all bundled into one. And I kind of cut my teeth after getting a degree in psychology there, then went to UCLA for a degree in social work, and have sort of been trying to find that cross between social services and software ever since, in one way or another. So I think that probably covers it well enough for the moment. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you. So I'm Steve Payne. My current day job is Director of Operations at Pledge 1%. Before this role, I was actually in executive roles at nonprofits. I was the Executive Director of the Youth Orchestras of San Antonio in South Texas, and then moved out to the Bay Area to be the ED of the Oakland Symphony, which I did for 4 years. And so that is, and when I kind of decided to focus on the Salesforce piece of things and the data side, I found that a lot of former colleagues were coming to me saying, hey, you seem to have figured out the database piece. Could you help us implement our Salesforce instance? So that's where the Oakland Youth Chorus, Kansas City Youth Symphony, and the San Francisco Girls Chorus come into the picture. And I like to bike, so that's me out in Marin at a Point Reyes. So we did want to just acknowledge the place that we're in right now. A lot of you are in different situations to what you probably were planning on being at this point in time, and we are, I think many of us are grateful that the Salesforce industries is definitely one which is cloud-based, so we can do a lot of our work still, but of course the way we are implementing that is changed somewhat. And then in terms of this presentation, also I just want to recognize that there are, this is a women in technology group, so there are people at all points in the scale of their knowledge of Salesforce. We're actually going to do a quick poll in just a second. And then, so let me just first introduce the poll. So this will pop up on your screen in just a second. And what we'd like you to do is pick the highest number that correlates to you. So number one, you don't even know what a nonprofit is and you have no connections to nonprofit. So we're trying to cover everybody here. 2, you've donated to a nonprofit, so you have minimal interaction. 3, you've done some kind of volunteer work or worked at a nonprofit. Or 4, you currently work at one. And 5, you've been using nonprofit Success Pack within a nonprofit. We've got a couple more. I'm still waiting to come in. give me just a second.
And also at the bottom, it says there, if there's anything specific you were hoping that we would touch on today, you can post that there now, and we'll see if we can get to it.
Oh, there's 4 who haven't done, and that's you, me, and Sybil. So it looks like by a peak, we have most people have had some interaction with a nonprofit. A bunch of you, but another 6 of you have actually worked on NPSP in a nonprofit, and 1 of you is considering it. And we've got some others, but don't see any message in the chat on that. So, okay. Great, thank you for that. So a quick introduction to the nonprofit scene. First of all, we just want to have an overview of who's involved. So here you are as an admin, Salesforce admin, you've shown up, and you're most likely going to start talking to the executive director first. It is, they often have they've got a lot to say, which is why this guy is going to be chatting at us the whole time we're looking at the screen. And then pretty shortly, you're going to get introduced to some of the key staff folks. Development director, that chief fundraiser, most nonprofits are using the NPSP primarily for donation tracking. And then, of course, the finance director wants to have knowledge of that too, so you're going to get interaction with them. Often the finance piece is living in a different system though. The program managers, the folks actually running the program, they will often want their data tracked in there too, tracked in the database as well. And the development assistant is, I found, often the person who gets kind of assigned that accidental Salesforce admin role. So they kind of do this in combination with, assisting with their development director. So you're also it could well be interfacing with donors or board members. It's not uncommon for nonprofits to have some pretty heavy involvement from their board of directors, especially a smaller nonprofit. Also, as I say, looking to see if you may need to set up some interaction for program constituents. Another key component is volunteers. So as you look at this map, you might be thinking about what are some of the profiles that need to be set up to accommodate all of these different folks that will be interfacing with the data. Do some of them just need to receive the data via reports? Then there is a video in here which we won't play right now, but this is a great sort of introduction of the Nonprofit Success Pack from Salesforce, why they built it. So we've got the link in there when you get this slide deck afterwards. I encourage you to go and check this out. It might be a useful video for you to share with nonprofits that are thinking about using Salesforce. But they've built a tool which is really designed for the whole gamut of nonprofits. We've got a couple of slides just on terminology. Again, just mainly as a takeaway, but just some things to be cognizant of. You'll hear nonprofits talking about pledges and payments. So that is simply somebody making a verbal commitment or a written commitment to make a donation. And then the payment is when they actually make the donation. More common with larger gifts, a board member will say, I promise to pay you my $500 donation in October when my company gives out bonuses. That's the convenient time for me to donate. And it's great for you as a nonprofit to be able to track that ahead of time. You'll hear the terms accrual accounting and cash accounting. So that's simply differentiating between whether you're recognizing cash when it's in the door or cash when you're planning on spending it. Hard credit and soft credit, this is a key term. You'll see that contact role, which Dodie will jump into in more detail later on, but that contact role enables you to track whether somebody has influence in somebody else giving a donation, and you can give them soft credit if they've done that. Again, a common example is a board member calls up their colleagues, their business partners and so on, and kind of leans on them a little bit and say, I've given $500 to this nonprofit. We've got a campaign right now. You should really think about giving to them. If that person gives a donation, you can credit your board member with that soft credit and get a running total of how much influence they've had in your donation pool. Direct giving and indirect giving. So you're most commonly thinking of giving a donation directly from you to a nonprofit, but there are other vehicles in place where organizations will use, a donor will use a donor advised fund. Perhaps they've even set up a foundation, or they may donate to you from their family business. And so it's another way where we call indirect giving, where the person is saying, I want to make this donation, I can make it happen, and they initiate a transaction from another entity. Creating support and restricted gifts. And this is a key one because nonprofits always looking for that general support or operating support that covers all the bills, the rent, keeping the lights on, as it were, paying the back end staff or the finance people and all those kind of folks. And a restricted gift is a donor saying, I want to support a specific project or a specific initiative that the nonprofit is doing. I'll just hit a couple on here. You know, this touch point versus moves management terminology. That's really the development director talking about how often they can interface with a potential donor. Can they move them through? That's the touch point. And then a series of touch point is the moves management. It's deliberately deepening your engagement with that donor as you progress them towards making a gift. Libunts and Cybunts, I kind of like this one because it just sounds goofy, but it are simple acronyms. Last year, but unfortunately not this year. So that's, give me a report of everybody who gave last year, who gave last year but hasn't yet given us a gift this year. That's a Libunt report. And then you may want to broaden the pool, somebody who's given to us at some point in the past, but they haven't given to us this year. Every year, nonprofits will be running these reports to try and collect those donors that they want to encourage to give this year. Matching gifts and matching grants sound very similar, quite different. Matching gift is when your employer will match your gift. A matching grant is more like, it's sometimes called a challenge grant. So a donor will put up $10,000. You hear this on the radio all the time, and on NPR all the time. We've got a $5,000 challenge grant, and they only give us this money. All of you out there also give us $5,000 collectively. The major gift category, we'll dig into that a little bit more later on. And some of these others are just, we want to just put up there for you just to be able to go check out on your own, because you will see these terms come up quite frequently. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to push forward. So we wanted to just cover kind of where the money will be coming from. And as I talk through these categories, you'll think of these as those opportunity record types that you're going to be setting up in the system. NPSP comes with many of these pre-configured, but every nonprofit is different, so you're going to need to adjust these to some extent. So the donation, and the pie, by the way, does represent an approximation of nationally of where nonprofits receive funds from. So you'll see the vast majority of gifts as a donation coming in through the mail, monthly gift. It might be the vast majority of transactions, but it's not the largest amount of money that comes in. But that's where a lot of your work will be in kind of making that as automated as possible. Every nonprofit should be thinking of what their major gift category is. Quite often it's $1,000 for a larger nonprofit, and maybe $5,000 or even $10,000 once you get to those large institutions with 100 employees. But it really designates when does a solicitation or the ask for that gift, when does it become a one-on-one conversation, a personal somebody picks up the phone and asks them to do this, as opposed to receiving something in the mail or asking somebody to respond to an email or a social media campaign. Grants will be coming from foundations. Very often you'll see a letter of intent being asked. So that's simply a large foundation will say to nonprofits, we have this grant initiative, we want to give away $500,000 to 50 organizations. You can apply for this, but we don't want you to waste your time doing the full application. We're going to ask you to do a letter of intent just to tell us what you're thinking about applying for. We can see if you are fit for what we're looking to do as a foundation. And then we'll ask you to do the full grant application with all the financials and everything else that they would want. And very often those grants are coming in over multiple years. So you'll be given a 3-year grant. And so again, you're thinking about how can you track a grant of $10,000 a year, a $30,000 grant, how are you gonna track that in a database? Revenue will come in for events or concerts that are happening. Was very common in the field I was working in, or a fee for service. What is the nonprofit offering to the community? And sometimes there's paid services, and then they offer scholarships for those that can't afford it. And there's also government grants, which of course can be city, state, or federal grants. And those will often have some kind of contract associated with them. And then finally, I mean, this is a surprisingly small slice of the pie, because we hear about what companies are doing a lot when you look at any adverts on any commercials on the television. There's about 5% of revenue for nonprofits comes from corporations, but of course they're looking for that sponsorship piece, that recognition. And companies can give their money to a nonprofit through all kinds of different vehicles. Sometimes they set up a donor advice fund, sometimes they have their own foundation, and many of them will do a matching gift, where if you're an employee and you give $100, the company agrees to also give $100 to match that. And finally, we've got the in-kind gifts, which is people offering their services, which may be some of you, if you're offering to help a nonprofit for free, what would you normally charge? And that can also be tracked as in the opportunity object in Salesforce. So these are just some examples of other ways money may come into your Facebook or social media campaign, that employee giving I just mentioned. Benevity is a tool that a lot of companies use to track employee giving across the whole company. And then they may funnel that through Benevity, which is just a software program which you'll see corporations using. Salesforce has actually just launched their own called the Philanthropy Cloud. And there's United Way does a similar thing. They're encouraging employees to give. Okay, and then on to Pledge 1%. What is Pledge 1%? Here we are at Times Square in New York. That's me at the back. I always get put at the back because I'm relatively tall. And we actually opened NASDAQ on Giving Tuesday. So we invited a lot of the companies that are involved in Pledge 1% to come and ring the bell and open the NASDAQ stock exchange that morning on Giving Tuesday. Giving Tuesday is always the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So Pledge 1% is a global movement to create a new normal where giving back is baked into the DNA of companies of all sizes from the very beginning. But basically, Pledge 1% is encouraging companies to leverage their assets as a company to do good in the world. And we've created a model to help do that. And that model covers 4 basic things, which is your employees have time to give. How can you leverage the time of your employees to help a nonprofit? Your company may produce something which a nonprofit can use. You see this a lot in the technology space. So Salesforce, obviously a good example, giving nonprofits the licenses to use of their Salesforce instance. And what is the value of that product is what they are essentially donating to nonprofits. Profit is more the traditional way, but here we're saying pledge 1% of what your annual profit margin is. And so it's tied to the growth of the company. And the concept is if you're a small company that's growing fast, if you make this pledge, your giving will grow naturally over time. And then giving equity is when those companies that make it big and get sold, get acquired, or they get go through an IPO and go onto the stock exchange, there's a huge influx of cash coming into the company. And if the company has made an equity pledge, that's very often when they're set up that company foundation or they set up a donor advised fund in the name of the company as a way to leverage the value of the company itself to support nonprofits. And we now have 11,000 companies across the world. It's a truly global movement. And so what's kind of fun is, I have calls most weeks talking to people in companies all over the world who are interested in signing up for Pledge 1%. And these are just some of the companies that have made that commitment, so that you study that more in detail later. And then briefly, before I pass it over to Dodie, you'll hear Salesforce talk about the 1-1-1 model, and that's kind of evolved to be called Pledge 1%, called the 1% giving model, or pledging 1%. Mark Benioff is actually credited with coming up with this idea of embedding that into the infrastructure of the company and making it one of the core values of the company to give back. And you can see the influence that they've now had. So Salesforce, but also Atlassian are key supporters of Pledge 1% as we look to promote this giving model and give support to companies figuring out how to implement it. Any questions we want to cover here? Anything come in the chat? Somebody like
Stephen, I have a question.
Please, go ahead.
This is Sybil. So is there anything in this model that talks about annual giving that you guys do when you're doing this in any of the nonprofits, like kind of do like an annual yearly giving amount, set amount? Is that usually set up in Salesforce NPSP?
Well, Pledge 1%, our role is to talk to companies. We actually don't talk to nonprofits. We encourage companies to choose which nonprofits they want to support and get active in actually supporting them. So I think your question is more related to from the nonprofits perspective, but the 1% profit pledge is where we encourage the companies to just make that commitment that 1% of their profits will be given out to nonprofits each year. As they make more money, we're hoping that 1% grows as in dollar value. We're hoping that they choose more and more nonprofits to support.
Thank you for answering that. Appreciate it.
Did you want to pick things up from here? And I'll keep an eye on the questions. We've got a couple come in, but we might be able to catch them once we've gone through this, your NPSP specific.
I thought maybe Sybil's question might have also been referring to like an annually recurring donation. And that's, that's really big, important. People are much more likely to keep giving once they get started on that recurring giving. I don't know if we have those statistics in the slide deck, but yeah, that's something that we definitely want to encourage and keep track of in Salesforce. All right, so here's another poll to ask how you all know, what you all know about NPSP. So one would be almost nothing or nothing about NPSP. 2 is I know Salesforce pretty well, but almost nothing about NPSP. 3 is I have studied NPSP or implemented it as a demo. 4, I've helped a nonprofit with NPSP as a volunteer or consultant, or something else. And if you say something else, please let us know what that is in the chat. Great. So 40% have done some work with NPSP as a volunteer or consultant. And then 33% knows Salesforce pretty well, but not NPSP. And then 20% knows something about NPSP. And some other 7%. And in the chat, I see fund development and donors, meaning, have done some work in a nonprofit, but not on Salesforce, maybe? And someone else, Laurel, thank you, noted that recurring gifts can be monthly as well as annually. Yeah, good point. And also, Laurel suggests using forecasting in Salesforce for your opportunities and automating renewals. Awesome.
Cool.
All right, so I just wanted to, especially for those who know about Salesforce, but not NPSP and not nonprofits, to create sort of an analogy. So Salesforce was developed to be a B2B, business to business product of selling into companies. And so translating that to the nonprofit setting, in a lot of ways it's similar or the same, and in some ways it's very different. So take a moment to think about, you have a sales team often, they need highly qualified leads, they take their leads through a sales cycle, and they have a quota that they're trying to meet. What is the equivalent in the nonprofit setting for these? And for the moment, we're thinking not about differences, but similarities. And if you want to go ahead and post in the chat an idea for any one of these 4, what's the nonprofit equivalent? Any ideas? Anybody?
Chat room is silent, Dodie.
I see Gretchen's lips moving. She's thinking about something. Okay, Carol says nonprofits have budget versus a for-profit having a sales quota.
Right, so your American Red Cross or your church or whatever you're involved in, it has an annual budget, and then they say, we need pledges to keep the lights on, to do these projects. That's just as they don't call it a sales quota. You said
they call it something else, right?
The budget.
Yeah, how much money do we need to raise?
Yeah.
Fund drive would be maybe kind of like the sales process you're thinking, Gretchen?
Right, that would be one way to bring income or raise funding.
Great. And sales is equivalent to fundraising. I like that. Opportunities and donations. Yeah, opportunities. Right. And the whole question of terminology is a whole can of worms. Very debatable. You know, Salesforce is so customizable. That's the beauty of it. You could change the name of the opportunities to gifts or donations, but then that brings up a whole host of problems. And personally, I'm in favor of not changing the name and asking the nonprofit to get used to the term opportunity so that when they go to Dreamforce or look up some documentation or watch a video or use Trailhead or talk to someone that's integrating software with their Salesforce instance and they say opportunities, that they know what they're talking about. But that's an individual decision to make on a instance by instance basis. Contacts would be volunteers and donors, right? And also potentially the constituents who benefit from whatever the organization is, the services the organization is offering. Great, awesome. So let's see what I came up with. The seesaw tilts. So for the sales cycle, we also have a cycle of stewarding a donor or potential donor through a very similar cycle. The sales team equivalent might be the staff who raises the money along with the boards who work with them to help raise the money. And for the quota, I was thinking of a fundraising goal. And we see these thermometers out in the community. And again, similar cycle of stewarding potential donations, and even once donations come in to work to get those folks even more invested and involved with the organization so that they'll continue to give and perhaps give more, sometimes much more. And in addition to all of that, of course, the nonprofit may want to use Salesforce to manage their fundraising. They also may want to use Salesforce to manage the programs that they're offering. And so that's a huge advantage of Salesforce, is that you can build it out to manage whatever you need it to do if you have the resources to do that. And Salesforce has recently come out with a program management component that can be used if it works well for the nonprofit's programs that it's offering. And secondarily, a case management module, which works with the program management model, but the case management model is actually a paid product. So CRM, you may see that word if you're not familiar already. It means customer relationship manager. And in the nonprofit setting, we changed the word customer to constituent, so it's still CRM. Constituent Relationship Management Software, CRM. And CRM is actually Salesforce's stock ticker symbol. A constituent is defined as a member or component part of something. So in the nonprofit, it can be any human being that's in any way involved with the organization. Donors, board members, advisory committee members, any kind of supporters, clients, any kind of beneficiaries. And I think perhaps in the nonprofit setting, those touch points that Steve mentioned earlier go beyond maybe what happens in a typical sales cycle, where you might have phone calls, emails, you might have personal meetings, but in a nonprofit, you're also going to be doing all kinds of newsletters, annual reports, inviting people to special events, and more and more. So helping the nonprofit be able to pull the data out and use that data for all the kinds of communication with the constituents is going to be part of the challenge. We're not just noting when the deal closes, that's when the sales cycle typically ends. But in the nonprofit setting, we're also registering that money coming in, and that's that superhero character that we saw in the beginning who has to manually, or in some cases in an automated way, make sure that the donations are coming in and getting coded properly. We call it coding them, meaning getting all the fields correctly marked so that everything kind of, it's the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? You got to get everything in a neat and tidy way so that when you pull the reports, everything lands where it needs to. And that can be hugely challenging. And one example of that is restricted and unrestricted gifts. If they need to keep track of that separately, Salesforce can accommodate that, but you need to set it up and it needs to happen in an ongoing way. So just a little bit of history. I find it interesting to know sort of where this has come from and how it's changed over the years. But from the very, very beginning of Salesforce, they were doing this 1-1-1 commitment, and they were giving away the product and to qualified nonprofits. And that was, back in 1998, 1999. And the community started trying to figure out how can we make this B2B sales tool work for nonprofits. And everybody was sort of off doing their own thing, and they kind of came together as a community and started building something that was called at the time the Nonprofit Starter Pack. And it went through version 1 in around 2008, came version 2, and by 2014 it had become version 3, which is the major version that we are on now. And then sometime there was also this other company called Round Corner that created a product called NGOC, NGO Connect, NGO being like a non-governmental organization, which is another term for nonprofit. And Salesforce actually adopted that as their nonprofit offering for about a year. They bought up Round Corner, but then they went back to the NPSP and changed that S from starter to success. So it became the Nonprofit Success Pack. They are not two different things. It's the same thing, just the name changed and the version changed over time. But we are still in version 3 of the Nonprofit Success Pack. And of course, during the same period of time, in 2016, we went from the classic user interface and the Lightning user interface was introduced, and many nonprofits are still making that transition today. Levels and engagement plans also got introduced around that time, which helps the nonprofit do those touch points, and that moves management, moving donors through the life cycle of involvement with the organization. And of course, Salesforce, everything is a cloud. So in 2018, they started referring to this as the nonprofit cloud. And last year, 2019, Salesforce.com and Salesforce.org merged, but Salesforce.org seems to continue to be operating largely in the same way and still offering all the goodies that it has been offering all along, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And there's quite a large audience for these offerings. I don't have current numbers, but last year in September 2019, there was this post that said there were 40,000 education and nonprofit customers. I'm sure that number is even higher now. In addition to the NPSP for nonprofits, they have what they call EDA, formerly HEDA, used to be Higher Education Data Architecture. Now it's Education Data Architecture. And so those two communities are separate in some ways, but a lot of overlap. Okay, so continuing on in the question of what is the NPSP, it's made up of these two components. It is a customized version of Salesforce, and Salesforce often mentions in its definition of the NPSP the 10 free subscriptions. And I have a concern that a lot of people get confused and conflate those two things. I want to make it clear that those are two separate, often related, but not necessarily interdependent things. I'll talk more about that in a minute. It's also open source and BSD licensed. It's on GitHub. So if anyone is really techie and wants to go dig in, they can go look at all the behind the scenes stuff that makes the NPSP tick. The NPSP adds objects, fields, an NPSP settings menu, and automation to a standard Salesforce Enterprise Edition installation. You can also add it to a dev org to practice and learn. So the 10 free licenses can be applied for by any qualified nonprofit. And if they don't need the NPSP, they can just use standard Salesforce. Perhaps they want to build their own solution for fundraising, or maybe they don't do fundraising in Salesforce and they want to build something else in Salesforce. So they don't necessarily need the NPSP, but they can still get those 10 free licenses and use Salesforce. And then as a separate decision, they can decide whether they want to install and use the Nonprofit Success Pack. So the Nonprofit Success Pack is a managed package that gets installed on top of standard Salesforce and uses these core standard Salesforce objects, the accounts, contacts, and opportunities. And I mentioned earlier, it is possible to change those names, but I encourage careful consideration before doing that. And Salesforce is a platform. And I have, for the 3 years that I've been hearing that term, been trying to come up with a clear definition from a practical standpoint for us Salesforce admins and for nonprofit users, what that means. So here goes an attempt at defining what the platform is from a practical standpoint, and I'm really interested in everybody's thoughts afterwards about that. So on the platform is built the Salesforce CRM that it's so well known for, the Customer Relationship Management app, and that is also the Sales Cloud. And Salesforce has other product offerings that are built on the platform that nonprofits may want to purchase and use, including Community Cloud and Marketing Cloud. Of course, Salesforce is big on security. Some smaller nonprofits may not need to deal with security, and I think that if the simpler they can keep it, the better. If it's okay for everyone at the nonprofit to see everything, a lot of times everybody wears a lot of hats and they're all doing everything. It's really not necessary to set up the complexities of security. But on the other hand, if they need that, perhaps for volunteers, for example, they want volunteers to access certain things but not other things, you can certainly employ all of the security features that Salesforce offers. Next, you have the ability to customize and automate. And I like this pyramid because it sort of shows the simplest things to the most complex things. And as you go up the pyramid, things take more time and more money, not just to implement initially, but also to maintain over time. Someone can come in and build you something fancy up here at the top, and then they go away and you have no ability to modify it or troubleshoot it. So that's something to keep in mind, is to see what you can do down here at the bottom of the pyramid and move your way up, with some thought and consideration. So we have reports and page layouts that can be customized, list views, pick list values. It doesn't even say here record types, big one that I should add here. And of course, you can add custom fields to track additional things that you need to track at your unique organization. Formula fields can be extremely helpful to crunch some numbers or do other kinds of things pretty simply. And then you get into the 2 point-and-click automation tools, the process builder and flows. Of course, workflows are in there too, but they're sort of on their way out, but still very much in play. Custom objects is where you start building out something unique to your organization, and that takes some forethought about data modeling, relationships, and then you get into the actual programming area of making things get done that you can't get done with Process Builder and Flow. And then, of course, we have the App Exchange, which is, like the iTunes Store, not iTunes Store, what do I want to say, the Apple Store, which has both native applications like the Nonprofit Success Pack, some paid, some free, and also things that can be integrated with Salesforce. Let me know what I'm missing if you think of anything in the chat or later on. So I really want to make sure that everyone is aware, because I was not aware for a really long time when I was trying to figure out how things worked in the NPSP, that it comes with its own setup menu. Setup menu is what the admin uses to configure Salesforce, and the NPSP Settings menu is what the admin uses to configure the NPSP. And each one of these choices here represents one or more, sometimes many, decision points that have to be made in collaboration with the nonprofit users to get the NPSP configured to work properly for their organization. And that requires educating them on the ramifications of the decisions, understanding how they work there and how they want all of these things set up. We'll see a lot more about this NPSP settings in a moment. Another thing that the NPSP comes with is 87 out-of-the-box roll-ups. And by roll-ups, we mean that the gifts are stored in separate records to the organization or household. Each gift is in its own record. So we want to roll that data up in various ways to get all these different kinds of statistics about their giving. For example, their total gifts over all time, their total gifts this year, their total gifts last year. That gets into the SciBunt and LIBunt that Steve talked about earlier. Numbers of gifts, largest gift, last gift, first gift, and on and on and on and on. And then we also have customizable roll-ups, so we can change the way these work or add additional roll-ups. And again, we'll see more about this in a minute. So this is the Salesforce official data model for the NPSP. I like the nice pastel colors, and I do like how they show in blue the standard Salesforce objects. We have accounts, contacts, opportunities, campaigns, leads. We have the opportunity contact role object, and of course tasks. So the blue is all standard Salesforce. The pink and the yellow are NPSP objects. And for pink, they're emphasizing people and relationships, and the yellow is emphasizing money. I think that this is a really useful diagram and worth studying, but it is a little bit overwhelming, I think, for some people with these lines intersecting and these strange symbols, and looks a little bit like a circuit board to me. So I've come up with my own version of this, which I would love to share with you tonight. And before I get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the household account model. This is one of the innovations that the NPSP gives us for Salesforce. And it's one of those big shifts away from businesses selling to other businesses to nonprofits stewarding people, human beings, to donate. And so there's been a lot of history and a lot of work, different models through the years. Some are still available, but not recommended. One of the first things you want to do if you're helping a nonprofit and you start taking a look in their org is to figure out which model they're on. Hopefully they're in the household account model, which is the recommended model. If they're just getting started, you want to definitely encourage them to go with the household account model. And the idea is that accounts can be households or organizations, and people are connected to households. Organizations are over here, and opportunities can be connected to them, but in a strict household account model, no contacts are directly attached to accounts. If you go into a nonprofit to help them, this is another thing to take a quick look for right off the bat and see how many organizations do they have where the contacts are directly connected to the organizations. Depending on how the data was imported for them, what they understood about this whole model and this best practice, it's very common to see what we call a hybrid model, where some people are in their own household, but some people are directly connected to an organization. Okay, so let's get into my version of the data model. And we start off again with the standard Salesforce objects: accounts, contacts, opportunities, Opportunities has a stage history object that is keeping track of the changes of the stage of a donation, which can be very useful. We also use the standard campaign object and campaign members object. And you will often find nonprofits using this campaign member object to make lists of all kinds of people, because contacts or leads can be campaign members. And they may be using that effectively, or they may be using that ineffectively. And this is another area that we can really be helpful if we see that they are, for example, I once saw an organization that was, for their annual mailing, they were pulling people into different campaigns based on how they are related to the organization. And then pulling all of those down into spreadsheets and then trying to dedupe from there, because of course people often have multiple connections to a nonprofit. That was not a good use of campaign member object, I didn't think. And I implemented a very different solution for them, which was a formula field that kind of filtered people into the right bucket, and we could pull one list and it was already deduped, at least as much as their database was deduped, which it wasn't, but anyway, it was an improvement. So let's see. We also have tasks and events, which can be attached to almost any object. And again, this is part of that stewardship, right? This is where you keep track of, you need to call this person back. You need to call them and schedule a coffee in the old days before Corona. And chatter, of course, can be used internally to make notes about an opportunity or about a contact or about a household, and share that with your team and keep that for posterity, and helping the nonprofit figure out which things should be tasks and events and which things should be chatter posts, which tool do they want to use, and getting those displayed in the right place on the page is another way that you can help a nonprofit be productive with Salesforce. Now here comes that opportunity contact role object. It's a standard Salesforce object. In the B2B setting, I think it can be helpful to know who plays a role on closing a deal. But I think in the nonprofit setting, it takes on even a much more important role because of that soft and hard credit that Steve talked about earlier. The person whose money it actually is the hard credit. They make the donation and they get what's called a hard credit. But other people may have played a role. And especially when it comes to those donor-advised funds, where the money is coming from the donor-advised fund, but the human being who set up that fund needs to get credit for that donation, because really we wouldn't get it if it wasn't for them. And it's that relationship with the organization that's bringing the donation in. So by having this object here as a junction between contacts and opportunities, that's how we can give that soft credit. Okay, so far everything we've talked about is standard Salesforce. Now we install the Nonprofit Success Pack on top of that, and we get that NPSP Settings menu, and now things really start to happen. Each time you see the NPSP Settings twirl, you know that there's a setting that has some impact on that aspect of the NPSP. So let's see what we get first. First, we get those two record types of households and organizations that split accounts into two different kinds of records. Then we get advanced address management. This can be overkill for some nonprofits. You may or may not want to turn this on. So you want to learn how this works. It gives the ability to specify different addresses for people if they live part of the year in one place, part of the year in another place, or track the history of where they've moved from, and other features. And what happens is you often end up with many, many address records for contacts and accounts. And so again, it's one of those decision points to think through. Now, this affiliation object is super important. It allows you to connect contacts not only to their primary household that they're connected to, but also to other accounts. And you can specify in this field their related opportunity contact role. And once you've set this up, every time in the future a donation is made, that has that relationship, the opportunity contact role will automatically be created. Then we also have this other object called relationships, and it connects contacts to other contacts. And once again, we can specify a related opportunity contact role so that in the future, any donations that get made, if that role has been set up, it will automatically create this opportunity contact role. Now, those opportunity contact roles don't do much for us by themselves, but it's those customizable roll-ups where we can say, we have these various roles that we've set up for our unique needs in our nonprofit, and we're going to roll those donations up based on the roles, and then we can pull reports based on the contacts and accounts who have those roll-ups showing donations that they have influenced in various ways. For example, more direct influence, like those donor-advised funds, or slightly less direct influence, like this example Steve gave of a board member soliciting a gift. Or it can be fundraisers. Someone has a bake sale and raises the money. You can give them some soft credit for those donations, et cetera, et cetera. So customizable roll-ups are key for leveraging the roles that you've given on opportunities. And next, we have a payments object. Again, this is something to discuss with the nonprofit. Do they need separate payment records? By default, every opportunity gets automatically created a payment record. That may not be necessary. And this gets into the cash versus accrual accounting. You need to know what they're doing there, and you can strategically use the payments object to meet their needs and not overkill. Next, we have the general accounting units object. You can set those up for different line items in their accounting, especially when it comes to the restricted and unrestricted gifts. This is where we can specify that. And we can set things up so that every time in the future a donation gets created, those GAU allocations get made, or they can also be manually made after the fact. We also have an object that lets us designate partial soft credits. And that gets back to the slide that Steve showed about, you know, you get a Facebook sends you a big lump sum of money, and maybe or maybe not tells you some or all of the names of the people who gave those, who made the smaller donations that added up to the bigger donation. So Facebook gets the hard credit for that, but those individual people who made the smaller donations can be given a partial soft credit for part of that donation. And then we have an object that lets us give, and this is actually, I believe, another standard Salesforce object, that account soft credit. And again, for donor advised funds, I find this really useful because the donor advised fund is an organization, the donor is a household, and the foundation that manages the donor advised fund is also a separate account. So by giving an account soft credit to the foundation that manages the donor advised fund, we can see a list of all those donations that have come through that foundation. It's all about connectivity and relationships. Now, Salesforce.org recently came out with a whole new version of managing those recurring donations that Sybil mentioned at the beginning. So this is worth learning and implementing. As with a lot of things in Salesforce, they kind of released it in sort of a baby state, and they're going to continue to work on adding features that we need. So it's worth kind of examining, how does it work now? How do you want it to work for your organization? When is the right time to implement it versus the older version? Also built into the NPSP is an object to help you keep track of the deliverables for grants. Oftentimes you have to provide reporting at certain times during the grant. And so that's an object to keep track of that. And finally, in terms of objects, we have levels and engagement plans, which again can really help the nonprofit segment the donors. And as they make a donation, that kicks them up into a new level. It can kick off an engagement plan, which can set up a whole series of tasks to be done to steward that donor. And then we also have gift entry, which has gone through many iterations. We had batch data entry, then we had batch gift entry, and the latest and greatest one is just called gift entry. And again, it looks to have a lot of great new features in it and more to come. So again, you have to evaluate if it's going to be useful to your nonprofit to be able to enter gifts in batches through gift entry. And finally, the NPSP data import process, which is a somewhat complex and convoluted, but super helpful way to get data that may be in spreadsheets or in some other system into Salesforce, into the various objects where it belongs. So that's my biggest answer to what is the NPSP. So of course, a big part of that super person's job of getting those donations into Salesforce and coded correctly is to thank the donors for those donations, either usually by mail or by email. And that can be somewhat lacking in what Salesforce offers, and there often is a need to get another tool to add in to accomplish that task. NPSP comes with this relationship viewer, which is a graphical interface. If you set up those relationships, then you can pull these little bubbles around and it will create this graphical display, and you can see how people are connected to each other. Here's some of the automation that comes with the NPSP. There are workflow rules and Apex triggers. And down here, I'm giving you the link to the NPSP data dictionary. So you can see all the fields that the NPSP adds to your org. And this can be helpful in documenting how your nonprofit is using those fields. And so here's another way to kind of visualize everything that you get with the NPSP. You also get reports and dashboards specific to the NPSP. You get some bulk processes, you get a health check. And then above and beyond the NPSP, but as part of the nonprofit cloud, there's volunteers for Salesforce, there's outbound funds. Sometimes organizations that do fundraising also do some grant making. So this is an add-on tool that will help them with money that's outgoing to other organizations and people. And then here's that program management module that I mentioned earlier. These are some of the paid offerings that can be helpful to a nonprofit, and of course requires a bunch of evaluation of the features against the requirements, looking at return on investment, all of that. And finally, I just want to make sure that folks are familiar with Foundation Connect, because they often get confused. Foundation Connect is for an organization that is not a fundraising organization. It is strictly a grant-making organization. And so Foundation Connect is a separate product altogether. All right. Time for questions.
Been catching some of them as we've been going through the chat.
I put the link to the webinar, the spring release for NPSP, which talks about a lot of those things that you've been mentioning.
Great, thank you.
Great.
And Stephen, you can remember to grab the chat before we end the meeting.
Oh yeah, sure.
That could be really helpful.
I'm also going to do a quick time check, Dodie. We're at 6:20.
Uh-huh.
So I think we got about 10 minutes left, or will we running? I forget what our exact end time was, but just want to be cognizant of time.
We're supposed to be done through, yeah, we're supposed to be a little farther along. So let's see if I can rush through a few things. Or let's see, this was going to be your section, right, Stephen?
You were going to do it, but I'm happy. Why don't you just cover a couple of highlights and I'll pick it up at the data.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, you did it last time.
So again, this is all about donation coding and things to configure in collaboration with the nonprofit. This is a really interesting topic. I find that relationship between your data in Salesforce and your data in your accounting package. You probably have an accounting person or department at the nonprofit who's managing, who's interested in the money in the bank and reconciling that. And the question is, do you try to reconcile what's in Salesforce to what's in the accounting package? Do you try to connect them so there's only one data entry point and one feeds the other? Or do you keep them separate as a check and balance against each other? Interesting conversation to have with your nonprofit that you're helping. So I highly recommend to everyone, even if you're not working with a nonprofit, to subscribe to Evan Ponter and Aaron Creer's blog and learn their recommendations about report types and reports. Super helpful, great best practices, I think. So keeping the data clean is vital and an ongoing process, and nonprofits need to understand that they need to invest in tools and time to keep track of dirty data and get it cleaned up. That automatic household naming, which is part of the NPSP, has a tricky thing to it, which is that if you happen to delete or move the last contact out of a household, it automatically renames the household to anonymous household. And so if you go in to help a nonprofit organization, another thing to take a quick look at is how many anonymous household accounts do they have? And if there are gifts or opportunities attached to those anonymous households, then that means they're not getting the full picture of those donors, because some gifts are on their right household and some are sort of orphaned on the anonymous household. Here's an app that can be used for deduping your database. Here's those NPS. So in addition to the 3 major Salesforce releases that come out every year, we also have NPSP releases every 2 weeks. And that's what Laurel mentioned, posting something in the chat related to that. One of the things that got slipped into Salesforce in one of those releases was the Manage Household button. And so if you go in to help an existing org, you may not see this button revealed, and you can reveal it for them and recommend and train them to use this Manage Household button. It can be very, very helpful. Many nonprofits still have one foot in Lightning, one in Classic, so helping them get Lightning configured maximally and getting the users trained and moved on to Lightning is another task for all of us Salesforce admins. And for some reason, there's 3 different ways to install the NPSP. So without getting into details, you can come back to this slide if you want those details. Of course, the NPSP doesn't do everything a nonprofit needs, especially online donations.
So just one thing to be thinking about here, that I'm actually working on a project right now. Many nonprofits want to be able to collect donations through their website. And whilst it's possible to do web-to-lead collection of data using Salesforce tools, is they're not as easy to use as some tools that are out there in the marketplace. So this Give Lively is actually just looking at that one. If the implementation you need is fairly straightforward, that one is free, and it's because it's supported by folks who just want to enable this to be there for nonprofits to be able to have that functionality. But many of these have different emphasis on what they're doing. Like Rallybound is much more about people are doing maybe a bike ride and they're fundraising to say, hey, support me doing this ride or this run or that kind of thing. So just want to talk a little bit about this idea of making sure your data is clean coming in. We would have talked, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in just a moment, about using the NPSP data importer tool, because it's something that many of you will come across if you're being asked to implement Salesforce in an organization. Obviously, things to keep in mind are clean data in will give you clean data out, but if you put dirty data in, you're just going to get frustrated with the reports you're trying to pull. So some other common apps that are used, many nonprofits are using some kind of email service. MailChimp is pretty common, but you'll see other ones out there too. They can interface it in with Salesforce. A word of caution with those is some of the tools, MailChimp is one, will literally put a copy of every email. You send an email to 1,000 people, it puts 1,000 versions of the same email into your Salesforce database. And it puts it in there in the task object. So sometimes you want to configure it so it's just a subject line, or you want to have it configured so it's removing emails that are 6 months old or a year old or something of that nature, just something to be cognizant of. AppSona is used by a lot of larger nonprofits, so that's one you come across. Congo is a great tool for producing reports out of Salesforce, where you want to kind of give your development committee a printout of a sort of a donor profile that you've printed out of Salesforce. We mentioned EDA and Volunteers for Salesforce before. A tool, this kind of goes along while slides got a little out of order. AbleBits was a tool that I use all the time. Data Connector is another tool I use all the time. These are add-ons to Google Sheets. And so if you want to pull, you can pull your data from Salesforce directly into a Google Sheet if you use the Data Connector tool. Where I find this really helpful is if you get those 10 licenses in your nonprofit, but then you've got a development committee that every once in a while wants to look at a list of donors. You can configure a G Sheet to pull that data in. You set up a report in Salesforce, pull the data into your G Sheet. You can lock that tab so people can't mess with the data, or you can have it refresh every night. So there's always a fresh list of whatever report it is you've pulled in there. And then you can also use that data to aggregate things and so forth in another tab, just like you would in any spreadsheet. So it's a really useful tool. AbleBits, which is another tool I use all the time, is an easy way to dedupe data in Google Sheets. So that was actually a little bit about preparing your data to do this. If you're setting up Salesforce for the first time for a nonprofit, you've got to get the data in there. And there's a special tool specifically for nonprofits, which has been built in NPSP. So it's called the NPSP Data Import Object. And essentially what it allows you to do is to have one line of data can hold the contact's name. It can hold a second member in that same household. It can also pull in data on gifts that they have given and payments that they've made, so the check number or the credit card transaction date or so and so forth. So there's actually a lot of data that can be pulled in on one row. In the resources section, we have a link to a blog where there's a kind of somebody walking through good ways to kind of break down, because I wouldn't recommend trying to bring everything in one spreadsheet like that at a time. You want to piecemeal it out. But where this is very useful is it will automatically create those households for you. If you configure this correctly, and it takes some work to configure, but if you configure it correctly, you can bring in those households all as one unit. All 3 or 4 people in a household can come in together and automatically set up your household model, and then you can connect their gifts they've given over time. So I did this for the Girls Chorus in San Francisco, and they had 40 years of data, and I was using this tool for quite a while. I was setting that up. And then there's also ways for you to configure the additional pieces of the data model that Dodie mentioned earlier about those general allocation units and assigning opportunities to campaign and the soft credit, etc. So it's a pretty in-depth tool you definitely want to take a look at. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, just given where we are on the time-wise, but these are some of the Google functions that I use all the time when I'm getting data ready to bring in. So Len is going to count how many characters in a cell. Trim will take out additional spaces that may have been put in after a string in a cell. The proper function will capitalize the first letter, in each word in a string. Also super useful if somebody hasn't done that. And then you can start to combine these. And so then once you've got your data in that configuration, and I've mentioned you're going to be wanting to do a second import for the gifts that have come in, and maybe a third import for payments. If you're doing it that method, you're going to need to get very familiar with VLOOKUP. It's going to enable you to pull those IDs out of Salesforce, like 18-digit ID. You want to use the 18, not the 15-digit ID. Allow you pull those out, and then connect the new data you're pulling into Salesforce with the right accounts that you already set up. So, and there's another really cool trick, which it kind of blew my mind when I discovered this one, which is the index match functionality where you can combine both index and match, like we've got here, this last yellow line. If you combine those two, you're not limited to always having the data source be on the left. If you've used VLOOKUP, you'll know what I'm referencing, and you'll see there is a limitation on VLOOKUP. Just going back to the previous slide. There we go. Another common thing on data cleanup is this happens more often with companies, but you've been given the email address for people in a company, but they haven't given you their website. This tool, this formula here, will pull the website domain out of an email address. This one is also super useful. You've been given a website URL, but it's got all kinds of junk on the beginning and the end, and you want to get rid of all of that stuff. If you use this functionality, which involves a whole bunch of stuff, you're going to need to really look very closely at the copy. And I'm happy to email this out to any people that need it as well if they want the text version. But this will take out everything around the domain and just leave you that domain. Converting dates from European into US format is another function which I've come across. Okay, moving along here. Thank you. Resources. This is you, Dodie.
Okay, so I'm just going to go very quickly through these slides and encourage you to come back if you are interested in learning more, because we don't want to keep you here all night talking about all of this. But documentation, Trailhead, these short videos are super helpful. The Power of Us Hub, especially if you are working in a nonprofit or have a dev org with a trial going, you get access to the Power of Us Hub, which is like a whole Trailblazer community just for the nonprofit community. And we have our own nonprofit user group in San Francisco, which you can attend virtually now. All kinds of good stuff going on, including this unconference called NPSP Day that I got to attend back in 2017. Here are some great resources. If you're interested in studying more, and especially if you want to go for that nonprofit cloud consultant certification, the official guide, the official trail mix, my guide, and my trail mix. There's a bunch of partners out there that specialize in nonprofits, which could all represent potential work for us admins. And it's good to know that Salesforce, part of their pledge 1% of putting their staff to work, you can apply if you have a well-defined project for your nonprofit and get someone who works at Salesforce to help as a volunteer on that project. And so in conclusion, Salesforce can be free for small nonprofits. If they need 10 licenses or fewer, it's free. But to get it working properly for their unique needs, it's really not free. It's free like a jet plane or like puppies. I've heard that analogy as well. It requires an effort to make it work. A lot of nonprofits will say we have Salesforce, but it's not working for us. We can't even pull a list of X. And oftentimes that doesn't mean they can't use the report generator. It means the data's not in Salesforce, or it's not in a consistent way that can pull out the reports that they need. These are some really great articles that I highly encourage that you read, that you encourage the nonprofits you're working with to read, that sets the expectations of what it takes to be successful with Salesforce. Salesforce can help with every part of a nonprofit organization, but it all requires an investment of time, of energy, of conversations, and sometimes of money. David Giller is an interesting, fun guy to follow. He has some clever things sometimes, including this one I liked. We found a Salesforce consultant who does everything we want without asking any questions. Totally unrealistic that you're going to get what you want if you leave it all up to the consultant and the consultant just tries to figure it out on their own. It really requires that collaboration to figure out what the nonprofit needs. And there is a learning curve. So there are admins like us out there, there are consulting firms, and there are volunteers who are available to help. Nonprofits should be careful about taking on volunteers. Here's some organizations where you can volunteer or find a volunteer. But my closing points are, it's super important to invest in that analysis and decision-making process, to know that it's an ongoing iterative process. Start with small chunks, but then keep going or you won't be satisfied with what you have. Make sure users are trained in how to properly enter the data, and document those decisions, the configurations and the procedures, especially because people move on and the next person comes and says, where's the documentation? And you get this blank look like, what documentation? So this is another video that I highly recommend. It's a little bit dated. It's right around when Lightning was coming out, but these three guys really talk a lot about what it takes to make NPSP work for a nonprofit, how to save money, but it takes time in exchange for money to invest. Either way, it's an investment. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you for sticking around, those of you who did. And we love to stick around and take any questions or comments or input. And thank you so much, Sybil, for organizing and having us.
Yeah, thanks. Do you want to stop sharing your screen, Dodie? Then we can see.
Sure.
Everybody.
Let's see.
Laura, did you want to talk a little bit about the nonprofit cloud certification? And you put up the link in there for the beta. I don't know, did you take that? Did you go through the beta thing as well?
No, I just saw it in the message boards. I'm certified from Dreamforce last year, so I'm not in the beta, but they're redoing the nonprofit consultant cert, and they're looking for folks to sign up as you get to take the exam for free, essentially. There's a very long link I put in the chat to the community post, so you'll have to sign into the success community, but all the information's there. And then the study guide I added as well. I will let you know it looks worse. It's like way longer. And
Oh, really?
it's like 150 questions in 180 minutes or something ridiculous like that. But you can take it for free if you do it like now. So at least you don't pay for the pain.
Or you can take the one that's out there now and kind of get
or
it.
Take the normal one right now before they push it over.
Awesome. Well, yes.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank everyone again. I do have a couple announcements. If you wanted to know about a couple of roles that I heard about, I can go ahead and share the information in the chat if you guys like, and just grab it from there since we're short on time. If anyone had any more announcements, let me know. I'll go ahead and let Dodie and Stephen finish up what they had to say. I don't want to interrupt you, but go ahead.
No, go ahead. Why don't you put those jobs up in the chat, Sybil? And we want to also see if anybody does have any other questions. We tried to address some of them as they've been coming in on the chat, but anybody want to chime in with a question? You still got 18 people here? Okay. What do you got on the job front, Sybil?
Okay, so basically there's two different companies. One is actually Pear Therapeutics, so they're like a therapeutic type of actual, I guess, business that's a startup, and they have a developer's position open, and then K2 Partners also had a BA position open. The woman called me actually today. And the information, her name is Tamron. I'll put her in, and Christine is her name. So that's a 9-month contract, and that's in San Francisco. Actually, both of these positions in San Francisco, so feel free to grab information there. If you want information, I can put my email here as well. You can reach me out to me directly. I spoke to both of these recruiters in the last few days, one on Friday, and the other one yesterday, actually. Today is Tuesday. But anyway, I'll put my email here. If you are interested, let me know if you wanted to reach out to the recruiter directly, and I'll do some introductions. So that's what I had. And I want to thank everyone for staying as long as you did. Great information, wealth information. Even though it was long, it was well worth it to stay to the end.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dodie. That was a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome. So we wrap this up, and as you say, we wanted to provide as much as we could in the presentation for you to have resources to go find things that you need to figure out on your own. But I think, to reiterate some of what Dodie was saying, You know, the nonprofit success pack is not something just to assume that anybody who knows Salesforce can just walk in and use. I mean, that's partly why Dodie and I wanted to put this presentation together and start sharing it more broadly, is because, you know, it's pretty common for someone to walk in and say, oh yeah, I know Salesforce. And I'm sure they do, but they don't know the nonprofit success pack. And there's some deliberate decisions you need to make, and you need to really understand what the nonprofit's needs are. There's also a lot of training that comes along with it. So, you know, our Salesforce accidental admin superhero we talked about earlier, a lot of working with nonprofits is supporting that person, telling them how to do the various configurations, how to just do some basic functionality, which they wouldn't have come across before. And it's actually kind of fun to, you know, to see them, their minds getting blown when they see the page view layout for the first time. You can start moving things around. So.
And also, I think the flip side of that is someone who starts in a nonprofit and knows the NPSP might be surprised at some of the things that go away when you go to a for-profit setting. So keeping clear on what's the NPSP and what's not. And
Pledge 1% is actually one of those organizations that uses the free licenses, but we don't use NPSP because all of our relationships are with companies. So we operate as a B2B, but there are some things I would love to bring in, a relationship tool. I'd love to have that.
That's good to know. Good information.
I think we're at time, Sybil, if there's anything you do. I don't know how you wrap it up, Sybil, but we pass it back to you to do your thing.
Sure. So I just want to thank everyone for coming and for staying here to the end. I really appreciate you, Dodie, and also Stephen for the wealth information. Laura, your input has been awesome. Thanks for joining at the last minute. I'm glad I caught the email that you sent. If anyone that did not give the email in the chat, please put it in there, because what happens in the Salesforce event, I don't actually get the full email, only get like the last 5 or 6 digits. So make sure you put your information in email so make sure we get everybody the actual presentation recording. I meant to ask to do that earlier, but people start dropping off. So hopefully other people that were on the chat will remember who was there. And I did say some in the chat, but reach out for some emails. And I thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for spending your evening here, and I appreciate you all. And looking forward next month to see what else kind of content I can bring up for the community. Del, do you have any last words, or you, Stephen?
Oh, I'll make one pitch, and that is I added the NPSP to my LinkedIn profile kind of late in the game. So if anybody feels confident to check that box, that I have some knowledge of the NPSP, I would appreciate it. Thank you in advance. And I'm happy to connect with anybody over LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Stephen?
No, I think probably talked enough. So just you know, we're both passionate about being able to help these nonprofits use their data in a more meaningful way. And we've certainly seen an uptick in the needs of nonprofits to figure out how to do more online, and managing data is a key component of that. So,
absolutely. I think you guys should do a series. I'm just letting you know. Should be doing a series. Because there's more information. And Laura, you can attest to that, right?
It was a little painful to cut our original presentation was actually 2 hours, which feels like it was a long time, but we struggled to fit everything into 2 hours, so we actually compared it in a lot.
I see why. You guys should do a series, I'm just saying. I'll be more than happy to learn the series and put my little 2 cents in there, because I can share some stuff later on, but that's another conversation with the nonprofit, with education. The universities, they do totally different, and the way they don't use it, NPSP, is interesting.
Yeah, a lot of them are using EDA, right? Which is... No,
they're not using EDA. They're just doing raw data and not using NPSP. It's interesting. Anyway, but thank you, everyone, again. I appreciate your time here, and you guys have a great rest of the week. And I'll save the chat again in case Dodie and Stevie did not, and I'll send you the link as well that I saved chat, okay?
Great, thank you. Great. Okay, good
All
night,
right,
everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thank you.